Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led a flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. When the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, Moses, Moses. And Moses said, Here I am. Do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. At this, Moses hid his face, because he was afraid to look at God. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people of the Israelites out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I will be with you, and this will be the sign that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. Moses said to God, Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, The God of your fathers has sent me to you, and they ask me, What is his name? Then what shall I tell them? God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites, I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, Say to the Israelites, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Go, assemble the elders of Israel, and say to them, The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, appeared to me and said, I have watched over you, and have seen what has been done to you in Egypt. And I have promised to bring you up out of your misery in Egypt into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. The elders of Israel will listen to you. Then you and the elders are to go to the king of Egypt and to say to him, The Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless a mighty hand compels him. So I will stretch out my hand and strike the Egyptians with all the wonders that I will perform among them. After that he will let you go. And I will make the Egyptians favorably disposed towards this people, so that when you leave you will not go empty-handed. Every woman is to ask her neighbor and any woman living in her house for articles of silver and gold and for clothing, which you will put on your sons and daughters. And so you will plunder the Egyptians.
Moses answered, What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, The Lord did not appear to you? Then the Lord said to him, What is that in your hand? A staff, he replied. The Lord said, Throw it on the ground. Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it. Then the Lord said to him, Reach out your hand and take it by the tail. So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hand. This, said the Lord, is so that they may believe that the Lord, the God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has appeared to you. Then the Lord said, Put your hand inside your cloak. So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. Now, put it back into your cloak, he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Then the Lord said, If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these 2 signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground. Moses said to the Lord, Pardon your servant, Lord, but I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue. The Lord said, Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them a sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go. I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. But Moses said, Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses and said, What about your brother Aaron, the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words into his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth, and as if you were God to him. But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it." Then Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Let me return to my own people in Egypt to see if any of them are still alive." Jethro said, "Go, and I wish you well." Now the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all those who wanted to kill you are dead." So Moses took his wife and sons, put them on a donkey, and started back to Egypt, and he took the staff of God in his hand. The Lord said to Moses, "When you return to Egypt, see that you perform before Pharaoh all the wonders I have given you the power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Then say to Pharaoh, 'This is what the Lord says. Israel is my firstborn son, and I told you, let my son go so he may worship me. But you refused to let him go, so I will kill your firstborn son.'" At a lodging place on the way, the Lord met Moses and was about to kill him. But Zipporah took a flint knife, cut off her son's foreskin, and touched Moses' feet with it. "Surely you are the bridegroom of blood to me," she said. So the Lord let him alone. At that time she said bridegroom of blood, referring to circumcision. The Lord said to Aaron, "Go into the wilderness to meet Moses." So he met Moses at the mountain of God and kissed him. Then Moses told Aaron everything the Lord had sent him to say, and also about all the signs he had commanded him to perform. Moses and Aaron brought together all the elders of the Israelites, and Aaron told them everything the Lord had said to Moses. He also performed the signs before the people, and they believed. And when they heard that the Lord was concerned about them and had seen their misery, they bowed down and worshipped.
Thank you, ladies. One of the most epic encounters anybody's ever had with God. Will you pray with me? Father, we come to you recognizing our own frailty, our own limitations, our own brokenness, and with a crying out of our deep dependence on you. But God, in the midst of our frailty, in the midst of our brokenness, you've also placed an incredible call on our lives to be your ambassadors, to be ones who carry your message of hope into a very dark and decaying world. So God, as we wrestle with that tension of without you we can do nothing, but in you, you have called us into something magnificent. We ask that this morning that we would wrestle with why it is that we are so hesitant so often to respond positively to the things that you call us into, to take the risks that you want for us to take so that we can be a part of accomplishing the mission that you have laid out. We love you. Thank you for your grace and your mercy. Thank you for the opportunity to do life together. God, we're better together. We recognize that. We get to do life in community with one another as we encourage and comfort and challenge one another. As we consider together not just what things have been and remember and with great nostalgia consider the past, but God, more importantly, ask the question, could you imagine? Could you imagine what God could do and God would do in the midst of these circumstances? God, the reality is, as we consider this incredible book that's been laid out for us, reminding ourselves of what you've done in the past allows us to have a greater understanding of what it is that you're capable of doing in the future. And may we lean into that. May we embrace that. And may our lives, our marriages, our friendships, our parenting, and our business ventures be reflective of a confidence of who you are, what you've done, and what you are yet to do. In the precious name of Jesus that I pray. Amen. Confession time. You ready? I am really, really skilled at something that I really wish that I wasn't quite so skilled at. The truth is, I came at this honestly as the very young child. I was told when I was a very young child that I was really, really, really good at making excuses for why I shouldn't have to go to bed, or why I shouldn't have to stay in bed, or why I needed the 15th drink before I went to sleep. The reality is that I have always been really good at making excuses. And I can come up with an excuse to pretty much justify or rationalize anything, getting out of any kind of conundrum that I may find myself in. I'm sure that I've gotten off of getting several tickets that I maybe should have otherwise gotten because of my incredible potential of making excuses, and I'm pretty fluent at that. Anybody else really good at excuse making? Yeah, you're all lying. Man, we are so good at this. Our hearts are so gifted at making excuses for anything. In fact, here's the scariest part of excuse making. Excuses empower us to rationalize away responsibility. That we don't have to take responsibility because we just come up with an excuse for why it's somebody else's fault or why they should be the ones. To justify pretty much any behavior. We can pretty much justify any behavior we want as long as we come up with a good excuse for why it's okay. And why under these circumstances, in this context, if anybody really understood the bigger picture, they would know why and understand why I decided I needed to do this. To tune out truth? Yeah, but I'm the exception to that. I don't need to listen to that. I'm the exception. I can handle the outcomes in this situation. And ultimately miss out on the most important or valuable things in life. Excuses have the power to rationalize away responsibility, justify any behavior, tune out truth, and miss out on the most valuable things in life. And yet, we are, most of us at least, really, really good at making excuses. And I really wish that I was not quite so proficient at it. We're in this book that we're studying together, Exodus, and we've said that Exodus is about the God who relentlessly pursues. And what we're considering together is the implications of this incredible story that's been laid out for us and really kind of held for us, preserved for us for thousands of years. This took place about 3,500 years ago. And we now have the details, and so much of this shows up in extra biblical literature. But man, in the book of Exodus, that second book of the Bible, this incredible narrative is given to us. We asked the question last week, why Exodus? And what we said is that regardless of what circumstances in life we're experiencing, regardless of what's going on politically around us, the reality is that we need to have a better understanding of who our God is. And so what we said is that Exodus is about God. It's about his power, his presence, his promises, his plan, and his purposes for his people. And understanding that more intensely and intimately is such a significant part of our own personal journey. The second is that we ask questions in the midst of really difficult seasons like, does God care? Does he see? Does he understand? Will he intervene? And for the Jews, when they wrestled with these questions, they look back on the Exodus and they point to the Exodus to say, yes, he knows. Yes, he sees. Yes, he understands. Yes, he will intervene because of what he did in taking them out of Egypt. And so for us, we have this incredible story that we get to point to. Now, we also have the extra benefit of not just looking back on the Exodus, but now we look back on the cross to answer those questions. But in so many ways for the Jews, the Exodus is the best that they have because they don't have the cross to point to. And then the third is, Exodus helps us understand the larger story God is telling that we've been born into. And that there is this story that we are a part of. And the truth is that if we don't understand that there's a larger story that's been being told for a long time that we've been brought into, we find ourselves then putting ourselves in the center of our own story, making ourselves the hero or maybe the most important person in that story, and fail to recognize that ultimately our story isn't about us. It's about God and his redemptive plan in our world. And so this encounter, for the most part, revolves around kind of what we're familiar with, right? It's Moses and the burning bush. And most of us are familiar with this. It's one of the most epic stories in all of Scripture. It certainly is something that's pretty common in popular culture. Lots of movies have included this epic scene of Moses and the burning bush. And so let's just kind of get into the text. But really what I want to do this morning, rather than just diving into the whole text as we've done before, I want to look at this specific back and forth between Moses and God, because Moses responds to God's call on his life to be the deliverer of the Israelites by making 5 very specific excuses for why it should not be him. And as we work through these excuses, what we're going to discover together is not only are we prone to make our own excuses, but Moses' excuses, many of them should resonate with us. In fact, as I'm working through them, many of them I know that in some way, shape, or form I've used myself. And so I want us to consider those together. And so about, 400 years transpires between Genesis and Exodus. And then we kind of worked through Exodus 1 and 2 last week, where we saw Moses, this fine child apparently, that was put into a basket and protected, and ultimately was brought into Pharaoh's home and was raised in Pharaoh's home. Some scholars believe that he was raised to be the successor of Pharaoh, that he was going to take over in Egypt. But Moses, we see his response to all of that. He gets angry at what's going on against the Jews, and so he ends up murdering an Egyptian leader or Egyptian soldier. He gets kind of exposed to that, runs out into the wilderness. He ends up taking on a wife in the wilderness, and then about 40 years transpire between Exodus 2 and Exodus 3, where we pick up the narrative. And so let me just jump into Exodus 3, verse 1. Now Moses was tending the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. This shows up many times in the Old Testament, by the way, a very specific scene. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in flames of fire from within a bush. Moses saw that though the bush was on fire, it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I'll go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up. Fire could have flashed for any reason out in a very dry wilderness environment, and so seeing these flash fires would not have been a big deal to Moses, but the idea that it was a flash fire and that it didn't go out would have been strange. But the language also seems to indicate that maybe this fire had been burning for a little while, that it wasn't something that had just shown up, but the language seems to indicate that maybe this had been burning for quite a while. Possibly Moses had actually walked by this same place multiple times before he actually saw or took note of the flame. And I find that interesting because I think in some ways we're oftentimes waiting to hear the voice of God or wanting God to reveal something or get God to direct us with something. And the reality is this: I think oftentimes we are often unaware of God's voice because we've already decided that we're unwilling to do what he says. I think there are times where we're waiting for God to speak. In fact, I've had men come to me and say this: I'm thinking about leaving my wife. I want desperately to pursue this other relationship, but if God changes my heart, then I'll go back to my wife. In fact, I'm going to give God a time frame. He's got a month or he's got 2 months. And if he changes my heart, if he somehow speaks to me, I'm waiting to hear from him. If he tells me something, then maybe I'll change my mind. Otherwise, I'm pursuing this. And it's so interesting when we take the approach that somehow if God speaks, then I'll actually do what he says, when the reality is oftentimes we're unaware and we're not listening because we've already decided no matter what he says, we ain't doing it. And unfortunately, so often we miss out on hearing God's voice in some way, whether it be through community around us and people speaking truth into our lives, whether it be through the prodding of the Spirit. There's lots of different ways that God does that. But oftentimes we're saying we're waiting to hear his voice, and the reality is we're oblivious to it. But for whatever it took, finally Moses takes note of this bush that's been burning for a while and not going out. And so he approaches it, and an angel of the Lord appears to him. And there's this encounter that goes on. We pick up in verse 7. The Lord said to Moses through the burning bush, through the angel that appears, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. Again, over and over again, God says in this book that he is aware, that he sees, that he cares, and he also tells us he's going to intervene. I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land into a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. God, do you see? Do you care? Do you understand? And he says, I've seen it. I get it. And now their cry has reached me. And God is now going to call Moses to be the deliverer. And Moses is ready. He's locked in because he's got his set of excuses ready to go. And so we see that first one where in verse 11 or verse 10, we read this, verse 11. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people from the Israelites out of Egypt, God says. But Moses says to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? Who am I that I should be the one to go do this? What's Moses' first excuse? I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. I'm the wrong guy because I am not capable of this. I'm not good enough to be this person. Now, it's possible that we could respond we could see Moses' response as a statement of humility. In fact, if you go all the way to Numbers chapter 12, we're told this about Moses. Now, Moses was a very humble man, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. What an incredible statement about Moses. His humility was striking, more humble than anyone else on the face of the earth. And so I guess the first question would be, is this statement, I'm not good enough, is it possible that this is just a statement of humility? I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. I'm not the person because of that. Well, can I suggest this? That there is a difference. There is a difference between true humility and self-deprecating avoidance. There is a difference between true humility of seeing myself for who I am with the flaws and the limitations and how desperately dependent on God that I am versus just being self-deprecating for the purpose of avoiding what it is that I know I should do or taking any risks or potentially putting myself out there in any meaningful way. And can I suggest this? Too often we mix up these two. That sometimes we think the reason why we don't do it, we're not the one who responds and takes the risk to go and reach out or care for someone or to invest our time and resources in a given situation, or maybe we're not the one who's willing to come alongside of another person that's hurting. We say, well, I'm not the right person. And we think it's humility. We think it's because we don't have what it takes. And the reality is, it's not an issue of humility for so many of us oftentimes. It's self-deprecating avoidance. We're just got to come up with a reason to avoid. And so we're going to make it about our limitations rather than recognizing that if God's calling us to it, at the end of the day, it's not about us anyway. And that he's the one who wants to equip us. And so we've got to also understand that. But the other piece when Moses says, who am I? Is I think in some ways Moses really didn't understand who he was. And the reason why Moses didn't really understand his own identity, I think there's some confusion because, again, growing up in Egypt and being a part of the Israelites, but also being part of that family, Pharaoh's family, I think there was some confusion. And here's the deal. I think Moses needed to better understand who God was because of this. We are incapable of determining who we truly are until we really understand who God is. And I need you to hear this. One of the reasons why our world is so confused and why personal identity is such an interestingly difficult thing for people to grasp, and why we reach for all kinds of stuff about what our preferences are, or what our internal stuff is, or what other people say about us. The reason why we allow external and internal forces to drive our self-identity is because we don't understand who God is, and we don't understand who we are in light of who he is. And it is only through understanding who he is and his designation and his identity that he has placed on us that we can actually understand who we are. And so we reach for so many other things, which is why it breaks my heart to watch the suffering of so many of our teenagers and young adults struggle with personal identity and grab a hold of all kinds of random stuff to give them an identity because they don't understand that they'll never understand who they are unless they understand who our God is. And once they understand who our God is, then discovering who they are in light of that changes everything. And it brings security, and it brings stability, and it brings a sense of purpose and meaning that is completely lost without it. So Moses asked the question, who am I? I'm not good enough. Hey, look at his second excuse. I don't have it all figured out. Look at what he says. Verse 13, Moses said to God, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your father has sent me to you. And they ask me, what is his name? Then what should I tell them? And God says to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. And I can imagine Moses going, that's a weird name for a God. How exactly am I? Who sent you? Who sent you? Eventually Pharaoh asks Moses, who sent you to me? And essentially Moses' response has to be what? I am sent me. What do you mean? This is like who's on first thing, right? Like what are we even doing here? And yet, what God is revealing about himself is deeply personal and so much more consequential than what we can possibly fathom. I am is the ultimate statement of self-sufficiency, self-existent, immediate presence. His existence based on him saying, I am who I am. His existence is not contingent upon anyone else. His plans are not contingent on anybody else's plans. His purposes remain the same regardless of what goes on around us. He stands ever present and unchangeable, completely self-sufficient within himself to do what he wills to do. In fact, we see this kind of bookended at the end of Revelation, where in Revelation, or at the end, the last book of the Bible, Revelation 1, where we hear this, I am the Alpha, the Omega, says the Lord God, who is and who was and who is to come, the Almighty. I am who I am has sent you. Again, Moses, you're looking at yourself, you're wondering if you're the right person, and I'm telling you it's not about you, it's about me. And at the end of the day, when we say I can't, what we're really saying is, when we say I won't, what we're really saying is God can't. Is that we don't trust that he is the one who's capable of offering that to us. Look at the next excuse for Moses. We keep going down in the text. He says that Moses' excuse and God's response, Moses answered, what if they do not believe me? I am sent me. Or listen to me and say, the Lord did not appear to you. Moses' question of, I don't have credibility. I don't have the credibility to do this. I'm not good enough. I don't have it all figured out. I don't have all the answers. And I don't have the credibility. So what does God do? God responds, and you see this interesting back and forth where God's really patient with Moses for a while at least. And what does he say? He says, look, take your rod, throw it on the ground. And he throws it on the ground, and it turns into a snake, and Moses kind of runs off. He's like, what is this? And then God says, take your hand out of your cloak. He pulls it out, and it's leprous. And then he says, put it back in, and it heals. And God says, here's how I want you to establish your credibility, that I'm the one who sent you. Use your rod, use this. And oh, by the way, there's a whole lot of other things that we're going to see God do that's going to establish God's credibility that Moses thinks has to be about him, when the reality is it isn't about him, and it never was about him. Go to chapter 4. I don't have the required skills. He says this. Moses says to the Lord, pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent. Neither in the past nor since have you spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue, which is fascinating to me because some of the great orations in Scripture we see come from Moses, by the way. And so this seems to be a pretty ridiculous excuse, but God even responds positively. God says this, Lord said to him, who gave human beings their mouths, who makes them deaf or mute, who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say. And then ultimately he sends Aaron with him as well. And then you see the fifth excuse. He says, I'm not qualified. In fact, not only is he not qualified, but he says this, essentially God sends somebody else. Take a look at it. Verse 13, but Moses says to God, pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else. God has dismantled his excuses, and eventually Moses is like, all right, I don't really have any other excuses other than I just don't want to do it. Just send somebody else. Like, I'm out. I don't want to do this. Just send someone else. And then we see God's frustration, his anger. It says this in verse 14 of chapter 4. Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, what about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He is already on his way to you, and he will be glad to see you. You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. God's response is anger and frustration because of Moses just continuing to mount these excuses. But ultimately to say to Moses, I'm not asking you to do this alone. I'm with you, and I will bring in somebody who will go with you as well. Can we just take a moment? I'm not good enough. I don't have it all figured out. I don't have all the answers yet. I don't feel like I have the credibility. I don't have the required skills. I'm not qualified. Find somebody else, God. Any of these resonate? Ever find yourself making excuses for why you're unwilling to do something that you really know you should do? Take a risk that you really know you should take. Some of us are so good at systematically eradicating our lives of risk to avoid putting ourselves in any compromising situation. The truth is, whether these are all resonating or whether one or two, the truth is we all find ourselves at different seasons of life finding ways to excuse, to rationalize, to justify staying where we are and not moving forward. Now, I'm going to push on you for a minute, and I get it. Like, I get this is awkward. I get this is uncomfortable, but I'm going to push on us just a little bit because I don't want to move past this too quickly. Because here's what happens. We think this. If God would just be more clear and more definitive of what he wanted, if he was just willing to be so clearly laying out the plan for what my future is, what college I should go to, what does my financial future look like if I take this step. If God would just be more clear, then I would be more obedient. And I think this encounter with Moses kind of tells us that we're probably not all that much better than Moses because God could not have been clearer. And here's the other side of it. For us, there are clear things, right? So we're told to forgive others as we've been forgiven. That's pretty clear. How well do we do on that one? Be sacrificially generous with what God has given us. God's pretty clear about that throughout the scriptures. How well do we do that? To surrender our sexual brokenness and gender confusion to his design and desire for our lives. How well do we surrender our sexual brokenness? To prioritize the gathering of believers consistently. To pray for our leaders, both spiritual and civic. Seek to live at peace with everyone without being argumentative or having a critical spirit. Not becoming complacent, always pushing towards greater obedience. How well do we do at obeying in the areas where it is clear and definitive versus in those areas where we think we need to have greater clarity? If we're not willing to be obedient in the areas where God has been clear and has been overt, I promise you, it doesn't matter if he hits you on the head with a 2x4 and puts a neon sign in front of you, we're still going to come up with reasons why we can't. Or somehow suggest that we're not clear or confident enough yet. And here's the truth. All Christians have the same general calling, but eventually all of us, God places a specific calling on our lives. For some of us, that calling is positional, a specific position he wants us to hold. For some of us, it's just a relationship he wants you to enter into. For others, it's situations he wants you to have to navigate. For others of us, it might be a financial deal, both in affluence and in deficit. For others, it might be just a position of influence or an opportunity to have influence in a given situation. But all of us have unique callings that God has placed in our lives, and ultimately our lives will be determined in so many ways by how we respond to those specific callings that God places in our lives. Ultimately, Moses concedes, and he finally goes to Pharaoh. All of the excuses are put aside. He's now going to do what God told him to do, and we read this in Exodus 5. Afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. Let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh said, "Who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." Pharaoh asked actually one of the most important questions in life. One of the most potent questions that we all have to answer. That's this. One of the most important questions we must answer in life is, who is God that I should listen to his voice? Pharaoh just asked the obvious question. Who is this God that you're coming to me with? Who's telling me I have to do that? What do we do with that? How do we respond to that? Who is God? Who do we claim God to be? And do we understand who God really is? The most important question we can often answer in life is, who is God? And why should I listen to him? Well, the problem is this. The encounter with Moses or with Pharaoh does not go well. In fact, basically Pharaoh kicks him out of his court, and he tells his leaders to tell the Israelite leaders that he's going to take the straw away, and they still have to make the same amount of bricks even without the straw. And the leaders, the Israel leaders, get ticked off at Moses for making their situation that was already pretty awful now even worse. And so Moses is basically mocked by Pharaoh. Now he's in trouble with the Israelite leaders. And then we see him come back to God. And in Exodus 5:22, it says this. Moses turned to the Lord and said, "Why, Lord, have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Just to make things worse? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble to this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. I did what you told me to do. You got rid of my excuses. I finally listened to you. I obeyed you. I took the risk. I went before Pharaoh, and now things are worse." You ever been there? You feel like you're finally going to step out and be generous? Carla and I have had this occasion several times where we decided we committed ourselves to be generous, and we were generous in a couple of different areas, very, very sacrificially. And oftentimes, right after that gift or that sacrifice is offered, we have a car that breaks down. Or we have some other kind of medical thing that now we have to deal with the financial implications of. And you're like, I did what I thought I was supposed to do. Are you kidding me? How many of you have stepped out to try to mend a relationship that's been broken, and the reaction of the other person is harsh, and you feel like all you did was make things worse? How many of you tried to take a risk to try to reconcile with your spouse, and they've actually used your apology against you later? How many times do we finally step out to do what it is that we think we're supposed to do, and it actually makes things worse? And we question God's faithfulness, and we question his goodness. Here's what I would say to that. Obedience doesn't guarantee success, but disobedience guarantees inevitable struggle and failure. If we're not obedient, eventually now here's the deal. Sometimes it's a lot later and greater, right? So sometimes we don't see the consequences of our actions right away, or our lack of obedience doesn't produce an immediate outcome. But over time, we start to realize things get worse. In fact, I would say there are times where 2 or 3 years later, something terrible plays out, and you're like, how did this happen? This is so unfair. And it's like, well, if we track back to when you were unwilling to do what you should have done back here, I love you, but you can't just mock God. You can't just disobey, and somehow that doesn't come out in the end. Obedience doesn't guarantee success, but disobedience guarantees an inevitable struggle and failure eventually. And so you see this tension, you see this building relationship between God and Moses, and you'll see it as we continue to walk through the rest of this book together, that this relationship between God and Moses becomes very raw and very real. And Moses expressing his frustration with God. And then in chapter 6, verse 1, we read this. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Now you will see what I will do to Pharaoh." Couldn't we have avoided this whole thing in the first place then? Like, why now versus before? Because of my mighty hand, he will let them go. Because of my mighty hand, he will drive them out of his country. And Pastor Ben will pick up on that next week as he will begin to identify the plan that God lays out to ultimately rescue his people. But this promise that's made, this promise of the Exodus, that God's eventually going to rescue his people. Exodus is an ongoing theme that comes up over and over and over again in the scriptures. The Exodus is often referred to as God seeks to establish and reestablish his covenant relationship. I'm the God who brought you out of Egypt. It's a reference several times in the Psalms as a celebration of what God has done and how we can trust him now because of what he's done in the past. It is used as a metaphor for the gospel to explain the liberation that we've been offered in Christ. It's also used to help explain the experience of freedom and restoration that we have in the Christian life. In fact, in the book Echoes of Exodus, Roberts and Wilson say it this way: time and again, Paul uses the Exodus story not just to remind Christians of our liberty, but also of our responsibility. It's actually at the heart of the Christian discipleship. Israel was set free from serving one master in order that they may serve a new one. God's purpose for the plagues and the confrontations, the water crossings and the fire, was not that Israel might be free to wander off and do their own thing. We've not been set free just to do whatever we want. Real freedom is not autonomy. Real freedom is surrender to the right sources and the right leaders. The water crossings and the fire, he was not that Israel might be set free to wander off in their own thing, but that they might serve him. The contrast in Exodus, in fact, is less between slavery and freedom as we might expect, and more between slavery to Pharaoh and service to the Lord. It is as if service to nobody is not an option. That we're going to end up serving someone. In fact, I would say this, in our context, if we're not serving God, then we are simply serving our appetites. And we become enslaved to our appetites. And those things that we go after to find fulfillment and satisfaction and gratification end up enslaving us over time. We see it over and over again. So let me just leave you with 4 questions. What might God have called you to pursue and or take on that you have made excuses to avoid? Some of you have a relationship in your marriage that you have yet to pour yourself back into because you're so wounded and you're still resentful. Some of you have an adult child who has wounded you that you have yet to pursue. Some of you have other family relationships that you've just kind of cut them off rather than keep a door open in the seeking of reconciliation. Some of you have yet to step into a ministry context to share your gifts and abilities because you're using Moses' excuses. I'm not good enough. I don't have what it takes. I don't have it all figured out. There's so many of us that it's over and over again in life that we know there's this prodding, there's an opportunity, there's something that God's pricking our spirit about, and we're going, yeah, not ready to do that yet. Which is why and when it comes to generosity, the opposite of generosity is not greed. The opposite of generosity is fear. It's fear that we're not going to have enough for what we want later if we are too generous now. Where is it that you are setting up excuses for not stepping forward in obedience? Which of the 5 excuses that Moses gave in response to God's call most resonated with you? I'm not enough. I don't have what it takes. Just find somebody else. Identify a time when you were obedient in response to something you knew God wanted you to do and it didn't go well. Go back and reflect on that for me. And consider the implications of if you hadn't done it, what could have happened? What would have played out? And then the last one, God's first call in our lives is actually into relationship. How have you responded to that call? Because here's the deal, for so many of us, we're learning how to trust God and how to be more obedient in certain areas of our lives, but for some of us, we've yet to respond to God's initial call in our lives, and that is he wants a relationship with us through Jesus Christ. How'd you respond to that call? Because if you haven't responded well to that call, none of the rest of this makes any sense. Taking risks that puts you in harm's way, taking risks that sets you outside of your own comfort zone feels completely impossible if I don't have a God that I trust to be my security and my stability and ultimately to guarantee me a future. How have I responded to God's initial call into relationship? And if you have responded to God's initial call into relationship, how are you doing at learning to trust him and to avoid excuse making, which we are so prone to do? Our hearts are idol makers, and our hearts so often are excuse makers because we will find a way to rationalize or justify whatever we need to avoid taking a step that takes us outside of our comfort zone. May we be people that are willing to consider the implications of what God has called us into, not just generally as his children, but specifically in our relationships, in the positions that we hold, in the situations we find ourselves in. May we be people that lean in and seek to be obedient regardless, because we recognize that he is good and he is faithful. And ultimately, his glory and our good are interconnected in ways we will never be able to fully understand.